Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from ASFX, I'm talking about the 2018 album by Man Without Country, Infinity Mirror. Okay, Man Without Country is currently the alias for the Welsh synth-pop artist Ryan James, although when the project started it was a duo with Thomas Greenhalgh. They first really broke out in 2011 when M83 officially sanctioned them for a remix of Midnight City, and James also went on to do a number of collaborations with Röyksopp, most notably contributing a vocal appearance on their track Sordid Affair from The Inevitable End, but also having done backup vocals on their more recent track Breathe from Profound Mysteries. Man Without Country has also done remixes for Moby, Suzanne Sunfor, and Interpol, among others. I'll admit that I'd never heard of this outfit before this request was sent in. I'd obviously heard Sordid Affair before, but that track's also on my least favorite Röyksopp album, which I never listened to, and I kind of forgot what that track even sounded like, so you could pretty much consider me going into this with a blank slate. Although since the Man Without Country back catalog is particularly small, with only 2 other albums before this most recent one from 2018, and one side project album under the name Secular Ghost, I decided to go back and listen to those other albums to get some better context. Their debut album from 2012, called Foe, was pretty dang solid, if also extremely reminiscent of that particular era of M83. A lot of super expansive mixes of synth-pop melodies and imposingly monolithic shoegaze soundscapes in the same style, and Ryan James' somewhat higher-pitched nasal indie voice wasn't even too far away from Anthony Gonzalez's yelpier vocal style. I can't really complain much since the style, as derivative as it was still really well executed. I mean, there were a couple of less interesting duds in the track listing, and the album could sometimes feel longer than it really was, but there was enough variety in its sound and enough good tunes with the more expansive and well-balanced production to really back itself up that I can still give it my thumbs up. It was a good time. If you're as big of an M83 fan as I am, then yeah, I can definitely recommend giving that one a shot. Their second album, Maximum Entropy, was basically more of the exact same thing, but longer and less consistent. I was tuning out for almost the entire first half and felt the majority of this thing ran together, but yeah, I mean, it still had its moments, such as Dead Sea, Romanek, Deliver Us From Evil, or the cover of the beloved Sweet Harmony at the end, which unfortunately had the best hooks and melodies on the album by a long shot. That album was just alright. The Secular Ghost side project album is also worth mentioning, not just because the guy who requested this video actually couldn't decide whether to request that album or the one that I'll actually be reviewing, and left the final decision up to me, or also because one track from that album got repurposed into the album I'm about to review, but also because this album is barely a side project at all. I think the only reason it was released under a different name is because it was Ryan James' first time releasing an album on his own without Thomas Greenhalgh, and it came out the year after their second album. Otherwise, it's basically more of the same kind of stuff as on the last Man Without Country album, albeit without the shoegaze elements and leaning more into some like synthwave and darkwave and very mild electro elements instead. Honestly, it's really not that interesting. I mean, if you just want some mildly 80s sounding, kinda Röyksopp-ish moody background music, then it'll do you fine. But for me, it just went in one ear and out the other. I guess it had a 10-minute track which had some progression, and there was a slightly more abstract cut called Two-Way Mirror that tried messing around with its time signature beat subdivisions a bit. And that was kind of neat, but there's really nothing here that stuck out to me one way or the other, and I just found the whole experience kind of boring more than anything. And that is, of course, also why, despite the requester having given me the option to review that album, I obviously instead opted to review the next Man Without Country album. As of now, the most recent studio album released under the name from 2018. The only other project of note released since then was an EP called Blood Side A in 2021, which I did not bother to hear. By the time this album released, Thomas Greenhalgh had broken off the project entirely, leaving Ryan James to take up the Man Without Country mantle by himself. And so it probably won't be much of a surprise to hear that this album kinda continues in more or less the same direction and sound as the Secular Ghost project. Although this is clearly a much higher effort project, a better fleshed out selection of 12 tracks with a couple more guests, and plenty of different little genre experimentations to keep the sound much more varied. I remember briefly previewing through both this album and the Secular Ghost one back when the request was first sent in, and my immediate initial thoughts was, One of these albums is basically just a more interesting and better sounding version of the other one. Let's put the one on the schedule that has tracks that sound distinct from each other. Now, I will first have to say that I gave this album my first listen before hearing any of the other Man Without Country projects, and my first reaction to this album was not a positive one. It definitely sounded like an artist with connections to Röyksopp, whose particular downbeat synth-pop style and appeal was sitting along the exact same lines, and I could appreciate the greater variety on display, but I found the execution to mostly be middle of the road and very inconsistent, with half the track listing delivering some decent tunes and ideas and the other half near completely falling flat for me. I just didn't really know what to think and didn't really even know whether or not I could even say I liked it. However, the longer I sat with it, it did grow on me, as some of the initially more baffling ideas started to make sense the longer I thought about them or looked into them. I still do not love the album by any stretch. It's still kinda hit and miss, and the best moments on here are just pretty good, with nothing that approaches greatness for me. But I did grow to at least like the album all around and appreciate what all of it was doing. Going through individual tracks, I will say the album does get off to a pretty strong start with the first two tracks. Preface combines a lot of vocal glitching and stuttering with some more moody electro beats and synth-pop instrumentals and atmospheric 80s guitar textures and a decent enough melodic hook to tie all of it together. Has some solid momentum and build up to it and does a good job of setting the tone for the sound of the project. And following track Lion Mind is about equally as strong a tune, with the same synth-wavy synths going up against some broken-up breakbeats and James sharing vocal duties with guest performer Sansa, even if it's surprisingly very difficult to tell their voices apart. Side note, I will say on a baseline level, Ryan James's voice was definitely the kind of thing I needed to get used to. That somewhat higher-pitched and boyish tone to his voice, somewhere between Neil Tennant from Pet Shop Boys and a more depressed Owl City. It initially threw me off a decent bit, possibly because it's not the tone of voice that I would have pictured hearing from seeing what the guy looks like. But again, the longer I sit with a given project of his, the more I just kind of get acclimated to it and it stops bothering me. It's whatever. Now, as likable as I found those first two tracks, they are immediately followed by what I feel to be the album's two lowest points. Remember the Bad Things, featuring Ralph Myers and Crucial Things, I guess is the big hit from this album, the single that saw the most success and attention for him. However, I took a pretty immediate distaste to this one. Instrumentally, it sticks to this way more generic, stripped-back mix of synthwave bass lines and not really trap beats. The melodic hook, while mildly catchy, feels really lifeless and makes for weak payoffs to weak build-ups, and something about the way the vocals are delivered on this chorus just feels wrong to me in a way that I can't really put my finger on. Just that bad things. It feels like it's trying to be some kind of clincher attempting to stick with you, but just falling flat. I mean, it's not an annoying track, but it's just so weak and limp and unsatisfying in all regards. It's just not a good track. Following track Beta Blocker, Beta Blocker. I do not know why he pronounces it that way. That one at least has some energy to it, and I can see that one being a stronger highlight for other people, with all the clattering 80s beats and stabbing bass lines sticking very firmly to those retro 80s electro synth pop formulas and trying to hit on those, I guess, Depeche Mode adjacent nostalgia notes. But much like how I felt on that Julian K project that the same requester also sent me a while back, I feel like this instrumental leaning harder into the 80s nostalgia sound for its own sake does more to make the artist feel even less unique for me. Not to mention the lead vocal hook is probably the most annoying one out of all of these tracks here. It's not terrible, but it's just kinda eh. After a beatless cut called Never Trust Anyone that has more pleasant 80s synth builds, which are fine and don't really leave a strong impression and weirdly leave me feeling like the track's acting more like an interlude in context despite being a few seconds longer than the more proper single Lion Mind. We then reach the album's centerpiece of sorts in Lafayette. Instrumentally, there's nothing really special to note about this track. It just kinda sounds like the average of several different tracks that have shown up earlier on this album in its stripped-back 80s synth-pop balladry. Not the kind of thing that stuck out to me initially, aside from the lyrics being particularly strange. I haven't really talked about the lyrics on this album since most of them don't really stick out to me, aside from the way, James likes to mash a lot of different metaphors together, I guess. But the lyrics on this track in particular did stick out to me as being more confusing and out there than any other cut here. Wrap me in your blackout curtain, raise the glass that's half empty, write your knowledge report, and sell me down the river? What the hell are you talking about? What are these metaphors? Who's Lafayette? I mean, it clearly means something important to the artist, what with the track's chorus name-dropping the title of the album, and this being the longest cut in the bunch at nearly 6 minutes. But I couldn't make heads or tails of it. So I looked up the lyric video for the track on YouTube and tried to see if anyone else had any insight into it. And I noticed one single comment that said the track was actually about Scientology, and that Lafayette was a reference to Lafayette Ron Hubbard. And when I looked back over the lyrics, I was not expecting to find how much that actually made sense. Like, there's also lines about being in a cult since birth and wanting to disconnect, with all these references to isolation and removing a seal upon my lips. Scientology is a weird topic for a synth-pop track, but it actually kind of works. I wouldn't mark it as a big highlight on the album, just since it doesn't really have much of a hook and doesn't really stick out in terms of the actual sound, but yeah, I can respect what he's doing there. Anyways, we move into the second half of the album. I do feel like things do start to pick up a bit more for me. There's a slightly more abstract-leaning interlude in Skeletons that has some marching beats that sometimes get played in reverse and some little chiptune melodic flourishes. And then we hit Achilles' Heel, which is kind of a slow but stomping new disco cut with like Robin S. Show Me Love synth blips, 90s house pianos, and little bits of vocoded text-to-speech voices around the edges. Also this very brief moment where James decides to rap under his breath, which isn't nearly as distracting as you would think. The whole track kind of gives me similar vibes to, like, the Noisy Freak Straight Life, I guess, and I can mess with that. Meanwhile, Jaws of Life almost has, like, a little bit of a drum and bass flavor, sort of. Never really tries to explode into anything more propulsive and stays very low-key and atmospheric throughout, but the brisker tempo is a nice change of pace. The sound is able to hit on a slightly deeper emotional level, and I swear there's some synth textures that sound like they're sampling Orbital's chime, which definitely got my attention. Can definitely mark that as a highlight as well. Next track is a reimagined version of Alcohol and Adrenaline, which originally appeared on the Secular Ghost album. Even does the Cell Dweller thing of crediting that side project as a guest feature here. I will say I definitely prefer this version over the original, since it has more actual energy. Although it's not a major highlight in the context of this album either. Like, the new 80s beats and guitars in this version are basically just trying to give this track more resemblance to Every Breath You Take by The Police. But I guess I also kind of like the vocal stutter edits added in some corners too. It's nice. Dog Mind is an interesting moment, instrumentally stripping itself back with much simpler 808 drum machine beats and darker ambient drones, and lyrically sounding like it's paying tribute to someone close to him that's passed away. Between the title and the lines about knowing this friend like a son, and how our stars aligned when you ran into the arms of my future wife, I have to assume this is about, like, his dog passing away. I mean, that's nice. It sufficiently hits on the emotional note he's going for. And then the album finally ends with the title track, which is a purely ambient instrumental. Just a lot of pleasant melodic drones that give me similar vibes to artists like Ulrich Schnauz, or of course some of the purely ambient tracks on M83 albums such as Before the Dawn Heals Us, before fading into some mildly thicker walls of noise and distortion at the very end as a reminder of Man Without Country's shoegaze roots. I mean, I may have heard loads of ambient tracks just like this over the years. If a track like this showed up on an Ulrich Schnauz album or something like that Apollo Vermouth album I heard at the end of last year, it probably wouldn't have stuck out to me. But it definitely benefits from being the only track on this album to sound like that, and I think it works well for what it's going for. Makes for a suitably satisfying finish to this project. And yeah, that's everything on Infinity Mirror. I guess it's a good album. There's enough here that grew on me to rise it above merely being decent. Although only just barely. I'm not gonna act like I came out of it with especially strong feelings on it. I'd recommend this over either the Secular Ghost album or the Outfit's previous album Maximum Entropy, though I don't like it more than their debut. Foe may be more stylistically derivative, but it had much better tunes and a lot more energy to get me more properly excited. And at the end of all the time I've spent with Man Without Country, I still get really strong vibes from his work of him being like an opening act. Like the kind of artist that I would see live because they were brought on to introduce a more famous headliner such as M83 or Röyksopp. It doesn't really strike me as A-list material in his own right. As many good tracks have come out under the Man Without Country name, he still kinda strikes me as being a less good version of other artists who are already more popular than him. But Still, I will give credit to this album for all the things that did work about it, evolving the Man Without Country sound into something at least a little more unique that he could call his own more. There are plenty of good tunes throughout, and it never runs together, with every track adding at least something of substance without any redundancy. Even if not every track works for me, I can respect all the work put into it, and I guess I'm less likely to even remember the bad things, as it were. Or possibly the good things either. I don't really see it sticking with me longer term, but whatever. At the end of the day, I liked it. And if all that sounds like it interests you, then feel free to give it a shot. I will just barely let this off with a solid 7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.